I'm going to start with, as promised, Abraham in Ur. So just to situate ourselves in the biblical geography, Abraham of the Chaldees, the call of Abraham here, circled on the map in that area that later becomes the sort of Babylonian kingdom. And you have this on your handout as well, this sort of area of the biblical geography and some of the arrows sort of showing the movements of significant peoples and peoples groups over the course of the biblical history. So that's kind of where we are geographically with Abraham. And also on the handout is this, which we'll keep coming back to again, timeline of the Old Testament story put against some of the people and events of secular history, if you like, with the events of biblical history. And we're starting here with Abraham around 1900 BC, so nearly 4,000 years ago, at the period of the patriarchs. If you ever get a chance to go to the British Museum in London, I encourage you to do so, and do so in the company of a book that will guide you around the biblical material that's there, or take a guided tour. There are people that you can get to give you a guided tour from a Christian organisation, will give you a sort of guided tour of the British Museum, pointing out that particularly the bits that reference the Bible in there. And this so-called the ram in the thicket from about 2600 BC. This comes from the royal cemetery in Ur, the city where Abraham came from. Now, this is actually a statuette of a markhor, a species of wild goat. This is not actually a statue of the ram in the thicket in the story of Abraham. As I say, this dates from before the time of Abraham. But this just gives you a wonderful example of the kind of artistry of the culture that Abraham came from. And when you're standing in front of something like this, and it's about sort of this size in real life, the years just kind of peel away, and you're like, someone made this and sculpted it and painted it, and the colors and the artistry, and this is the civilization that Abraham came from at Ur. It was, although a culture that could produce great beauty, also a culture, unfortunately, that dealt in human sacrifice. So this is Jean Jones here, an article she wrote about this, noting that in Abraham's birthplace of Ur, religious rituals included human sacrifice. One of the most startling excavations from Ur is the so-called royal cemetery, where that statue was found, buried in the royal cemetery, with its pits containing human sacrifices. Most of them adult human sacrifices, although not all. Abraham moved from Ur to Haran, not far from other sites where human sacrifices have been uncovered from the same era. And although there were also infant sacrifices in the regions, these are mostly adult sacrifices. And James notes this is significant because at the time that God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac was not a child, as shown, for example, in the biblical text, of the fact that Isaac carries the wood up the hill for Abraham, suggests that he wasn't a littleman, as it were. So actually, in the cultural context that Abraham came from, it was a culture where the religious idea of sacrificing people to the gods would have been just sort of taken for granted. And the strange and shocking thing in cultural context about that story of God saying, take Isaac and take him up the mountain and take him up to be off as a thing to be taken up, as a thing to go up, literally, is that God actually stops human sacrifice from taking place, and then provides the substitute and the animal sacrifices and so on. So that's a sort of interesting cultural background to the story of Abraham, and why the characters in that story react in the way that they do, in a way that Richard Dawkins, as he discusses this story in his Outgrowing God book, finds very surprising. The so-called Nuzi tablets, excavated from the Tigris River, 20,000 baked clay, cuneiform, the writing that you can press into the sort of wet mud with a stick. That's how this writing is done, and then it dries. Where the city of Nuzi once stood, and these tablets explain various cultural practices that can be gleaned from them, that are very similar to those seen in events of the biblical patriarchal period, sort of 2000 to 1500 BC. And these cultural practices have to do with all sorts of things, including marriage, the adoption of heirs, with surrogate mothers, with inheritance. Inheritance is a big theme in the patriarchal period and so on. We see that in the surrounding culture, that the Bible is accurately reflecting the sort of cultural practices of the culture around in the ancient Near East at the time. It's something that scholars called cultural verisimilitude, or getting the culture right. Okay, getting the culture right. So historian Paul Mayer observes that details in the biblical account regarding Abraham, such as the treaties that he made with neighboring rulers, even the price of slaves, mesh well with what's known elsewhere in the history of the ancient Near East. Selman here writes that since the patriarchal customs can be compared without difficulty with a wide range of material from the ancient Near East, from the independent viewpoint of the historian, he says the social parallels make the historical existence of the patriarchs more likely. That is, the sources are getting the culture right, and therefore it's more likely that those sources are sources from the culture, rather than say that the story was, I don't know, made up during the time of the Babylonian exile, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. It would be more surprising that it would get these cultural details correct, especially in an age that didn't have the discipline of archaeology and so on, all right? Yeah, you can't just go and do your historical research on Wikipedia or whatever at the time. So Gordon Wenham, he asked this question: why is there no Baal, the god Baal? Why is there no mention of Jerusalem in these texts? He argues that the complete absence of Baal from the patriarchal tradition points to its antiquity. In the second half of the second millennium BC, Baal took over from El as the leading god in the West Semitic pantheon of gods, yet he's never mentioned in Genesis. This is intelligible if the patriarchal tradition originated before about 1500 BC, but not if it comes from later times. And to the right of that quote is a photo that I took of a relief that's meant to show the god Baal from the time. And you can see he's holding, in his hand, he's holding sort of axe. Baal is like the West Semitic sort of equivalent of the Norse god Thor, is a thunder god, a storm god, right? So it's like a sort of Middle Eastern Thor, if you like. Wenham also points out that since Jerusalem certainly existed in patriarchal times, the failure of those narratives to mention Jerusalem as a center of worship is most easily explained if those traditions not only originated but were committed to writing, he says, before Jerusalem became the principal cultic center, which was around the beginning of the first millennium BC. So he thinks that both of these things point to an early origination and writing of these patriarchal narratives, because he would have expected narratives that were written later to have mentioned these things, and people not to have known, for example, when Bol took over from El, because you couldn't sort of refer to the historical research we now have to show you that if you're a Jew writing the Bible during the Babylonian exile, it just doesn't work. So back to Dawkins again. He asserts that Abraham's camels are an anachronism. They're out of place in the biblical story, because the camel was not domesticated until many centuries after Abraham is supposed to have died. This is simply a matter of ignorance on Dawkins' part. He's just wrong about this. So Kenneth Kitchen, who's a well-respected Egyptologist, notes that it's often asserted that the mention of camels and their use is an anachronism in Genesis, but this charge is simply not true. He says there's both written and archaeological evidence for knowledge and use of this animal in the early 2nd millennium BC and even earlier. Kitchen lists a bunch of evidence, including figurines of camels with signs of use, seals depicting people or deities perhaps riding camels, but certainly the idea of riding camels existed from the 18th century BC, references to camels in Sumerian texts and so on. He says there are other traces of camels much earlier in Egypt and Arabia in the 3rd millennium. The camel was for long a marginal beast in most of the historic ancient Near East, including Egypt, but it was not wholly unknown or anachronistic either before or during the 2000 BC sort of era. In his comprehensive study of the domestication of camels, and this was a talk at a previous ELF that I actually attended, Professor K. Martin Hyde, and you can find his article on this for free online. He has an extensive review of the evidence, and Professor Hyde concludes that the evidence points to the fact that the bacterian camel, there are 2 different kinds of camel. Hyde says that the bacterian camel, at least, was domesticated before the dromedary camel and were put to use by the middle of the 3rd millennium or earlier. And the gradual spread of the bacterian camel seems to have reached the Mesopotamian civilization sporadically, at least by the middle of the 3rd millennium, and more frequently at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 2nd millennium. And that's the area that we're interested in with Abraham. So Hyde says the archaeological and inscriptional evidence allows at least the domesticated bacterian camel to have existed in Abraham's time. So as I say, Dawkins' complaint here is simply a matter of ignorance on his part.